White plates gleam under Mississippi sun. Joseph Huber stops. His breath catches. Actual silverware. Not tin, not wood. Silver. This is the story of a young German soldier who surrendered expecting death and discovered something that would reshape his entire life. May 1943. Tunisia. Huber crouches in North African sand and watches the Allied trap close around 80,000 German soldiers. He was born and raised in Munich in the Bavarian mountains. Medical school applications sat on his desk when Hitler invaded Poland in September 1939. Operation Weiss destroyed those plans within days. The Wehrmacht needed communication specialists. The Luftwaffe took him instead. 3 years in North Africa followed. Exhausting heat, sandstorms that stripped paint from vehicles, operations alongside Rommel, Montgomery, Patton. Names that meant nothing then, everything later. The war carried him far from his native Bavarian mountains and the medical ambitions of his youth. On May 8th, the situation became clear: surrender or die. 80,000 men faced the same calculation. Huber and his comrades chose a third option: escape. They planned to reach Morocco on foot. For 12 days they moved only at night, covering 10 to 15 miles between sunset and dawn. Dogs barked in Berber tribal camps. They froze, waited, moved again. The French in Tunisia were hostile to Germans. Hitler had lured the Berber tribes with promises of their own government and liberation from French rule. The French remembered. Their hostility was not theoretical. After nearly 2 weeks, reality settled in. Morocco was impossible. They decided to surrender to the British, whom they considered friendly. The Americans were a complete unknown. An English lieutenant received their surrender. He handed them over to 2 American soldiers immediately. Huber recalled later, "We were happy to get out of the fighting." What followed was not what anyone expected from captivity. The journey into captivity turned out to be a long and unusual voyage. The prisoners were transported across the Mediterranean Sea to Gibraltar. From there to Scotland, where they spent 6 weeks in camps that taught them nothing about what came next. Then they were shipped across the sea to New York, Penn Station. Huber stood on American soil for the first time. The noise overwhelmed him. Thousands of people moving in streams through marble halls. Electric lights blazed overhead. Announcements echoed from speakers mounted on pillars. The crowds parted around columns of prisoners being marched through the station. Civilians stared, some hostile, some curious, some indifferent. New Yorkers had seen everything. German prisoners were just another wartime spectacle. Guards herded the prisoners through the main concourse, downstairs, onto platforms, into train cars. The scale of everything struck Huber. The station was larger than most German train stations. The trains were massive. The organization was efficient. This was American abundance made visible, made concrete, made undeniable. They were put on trains heading to a place called Mississippi. The word meant nothing to him. Another foreign place. Another camp, another set of barbed wire and guard towers. He expected nothing different. The train journey lasted days. Guards provided food, sandwiches, fruit, water. Nothing luxurious, but adequate. More than adequate compared to the African campaign. Huber ate an apple and marveled at its crispness. Fresh fruit, in wartime, for prisoners. Through windows America scrolled past. Endless farmland, vast forests, towns and cities. The country seemed impossibly large, impossibly rich. Fields stretched to horizons without bomb craters. Forests grew without artillery scars. Cities stood intact. This was the untouched America. The America that had sent soldiers across oceans, but had not felt war at home. The contrast with Europe was staggering. Germany was rubble. France was scarred. Britain was battered. America was whole. Camp Clinton. The train doors opened. Guards waited. The prisoners filed out. Heat hit them like a physical thing. Different from African heat, humid, heavy, thick. They marched through gates, past guard towers, into compounds, everything exactly as expected. Then they entered the dining facility. Huber's hands stopped moving. His eyes widened. Tables, set tables, with actual white plates. He expected mess tins. He saw porcelain. This moment, more than any other, fractured his understanding of what prison meant. In 3 years of African campaign, he had eaten from tin. He had drunk from canteens that tasted like metal and heat. He had gnawed on rations that were designed for nutrition, not dignity. Here, in prison, the tables were set. Camp Clinton turned out not to be the grim place with barbed wire that one might expect from the word prison. Yes, there was barbed wire. Yes, there were guards. But something else existed here, too. Something Huber could not have anticipated. We were treated well. Huber recalled decades later. The simplicity of the statement concealed its revolutionary impact. He was assigned to work in the POW hospital within the first month of arrival. Not cleaning, not carrying. As a surgical technician. Someone had reviewed his records. Someone had seen his pre-war medical school applications. Someone had decided that a German prisoner's dreams mattered enough to preserve. The assignment was extraordinary. In Germany, enemy prisoners scrubbed floors. They hauled supplies. They did manual labor. The idea of training an enemy prisoner in medical skills would have been considered absurd, dangerous, treasonous. But here, in Mississippi, in an American prison camp, such assignments were routine. The camp administrators saw potential, not just enemy soldiers. They saw skills that could be developed, not just bodies that could be used for labor. For a whole year, Huber worked in that hospital. 365 days of learning. He worked side by side with American nurse Marion Wells. She was not afraid of the prisoners. She did not treat them as enemies. She treated them as colleagues. The first week was awkward. Huber spoke limited English. Wells spoke no German. They communicated through gestures and medical Latin. Show me this, hand me that, watch carefully, try again. The universal language of medicine transcended barriers. By the second week, patterns emerged. Wells taught systematically. She demonstrated procedures step by step. She explained the reasoning behind each action. She answered questions patiently. She corrected mistakes gently. She treated Huber exactly as she would treat any medical student. We worked together for a year, Wells recalled later. The matter-of-fact tone revealed how normalized this had become. German prisoners and American nurses, working, learning, healing. The prisoners received the same medical care as Americans. The hospital was well equipped and located inside the camp. When prisoners fell ill, they were treated. When they needed surgery, they received it. The equipment was modern. The supplies were adequate. The care was professional. This was not mercy. This was policy. American policy toward prisoners of war. Huber's stomach dropped the first time he assisted in surgery. Not from the blood, from the realization that this was real, that he was being trained, that someone had decided a German prisoner was worth teaching. Living conditions included organized jazz orchestras, theater groups, symphony orchestras. Working prisoners received 80 cents a day. 80 cents for work done while imprisoned. The money meant less than what it represented. Recognition, compensation, dignity. Wells was never afraid of the prisoners. We never treated them as enemies, she said. The passive voice concealed an active choice. Every day, every interaction. Choosing to see human beings instead of enemy combatants. What struck Huber most about America was not the abundance. It was the humane treatment of prisoners and the opportunities for self-development. In a prison camp, in wartime, the tables in the dining hall were set. There was warm water for washing, decent clothing if the prisoners did not want to wear their own uniforms. They were allowed to wear their own uniforms if they chose. German uniforms in an American prison camp during an active war. The only requirement was that prisoners who wore American military uniforms had to have large white letters PW on the back. Prisoner of war. The letters were large so guards could identify them from a distance, but wearing them was optional. This stood in stark contrast to the hardships of the African campaign. 3 years of sand and heat and fear. 3 years of wondering if tomorrow would bring death. 3 years of eating from tin and sleeping on ground and watching friends disappear into the desert. And now this. Tables, silverware, training, compensation, jazz orchestras. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming at first. Huber's jaw clenched when he saw the first jazz performance. German prisoners playing American music. American guards listening. Everyone acting as if this were normal. Work in the camp hospital returned Huber to the path of his original dream. Medicine, the dream that Hitler's invasion of Poland had destroyed in September 1939. The dream that had seemed dead for 4 years. In the hospital, Huber learned surgical techniques. He learned patient care. He learned American medical practices. He learned from Marion Wells, who taught him not despite his nationality, but because of his aptitude. It was captivity, Huber acknowledged later, that returned to him what had been stolen by the war. Camp Clinton gave him back his future. The transformation was not immediate. Huber resisted at first. This was the enemy. These were the people his country had told him to hate, the Americans, the ones who had no culture, no history, no understanding of the world. And yet, the tables were set, the hospital was equipped, the nurse was professional, the music was real. Every day brought another small revelation, another moment where expectation met reality and lost. The propaganda he had absorbed for years crumbled piece by piece, not through argument, through experience. If this story ended after 20% and you're finding these insights surprising, a like would show that more stories like this need to be told. Now, back to what happened next. In the hospital, Huber worked alongside Wells for 12 months, 365 days of surgeries and recoveries and setbacks and successes. 365 days of learning that competence and compassion transcended nationality. Wells taught him to sterilize instruments properly. She taught him to anticipate what surgeons needed before they asked. She taught him to read patient charts and understand what the numbers meant. She taught him to care for patients after surgery, monitoring for infection and complications. She never mentioned the war. She never asked about his service. She never treated him differently from American medical staff. This absence of judgment created space for something unexpected. Trust, professional trust first, then personal trust, then friendship. The jazz orchestra played on Thursday nights in the recreation hall. Prisoners filled the seats. Guards stood at the back. The music started. Drums, bass, piano, trumpet, saxophone. The sound filled the space. Huber attended. At first from curiosity. Jazz was American music, enemy music, music the Reich had condemned as degenerate, music forbidden in Germany. Yet here it was, played openly, enjoyed freely, celebrated publicly. The musicians were talented. Some had played professionally before the war, some had learned in the camp. All played with passion. The guards tapped their feet. The prisoners nodded their heads. Music created a space where nationality dissolved. After the first concert, Huber returned every week. The music represented something he could not articulate at the time, but understood later. Freedom. Not physical freedom, something deeper. Freedom to be human, freedom to enjoy, freedom to create. The theater group performed every other Saturday. Prisoners wrote original plays, they adapted classical works. They built sets from scrap lumber and donated materials. They rehearsed for weeks. They performed for other prisoners and for guards who chose to attend. Some guards attended regularly. They sat in the front rows. They applauded enthusiastically. They discussed the performances afterwards. They treated the prisoners as artists, not as enemies. This casual acceptance of prisoners as creative beings challenged everything Huber had been taught about American culture. The plays covered all genres: comedy, tragedy, satire, historical drama. Some performances were excellent, some were amateur, quality varied. But the effort was always genuine. The opportunity was always real. The choice itself was remarkable. The symphony orchestra was smaller, only 12 members, but they were serious. They practiced daily, they performed monthly, they played Bach and Beethoven and Mozart, German composers, in an American prison camp, with American guards listening. Huber did not play an instrument then. He would learn violin later, after the war, but he attended every performance. He sat in the back. He listened. He let the music wash over him. He let it remind him that beauty still existed in the world. The 80 cents a day accumulated. Prisoners could use the money in the camp canteen. Small purchases, cigarettes, candy, writing paper, stamps. The purchases themselves mattered less than the process. Choosing, buying, owning. Small acts of autonomy in a system designed to control. Some prisoners saved their money. Some spent it all immediately. Some sent it home through the Red Cross. The choice was theirs. That choice, more than the money itself, represented something revolutionary. But this was only the beginning of Huber's transformation. In the hospital one afternoon in late summer of 1944, approximately 16 months after his arrival at Camp Clinton, a patient arrived with a gunshot wound, an accident during work detail. A rifle had discharged unexpectedly. The bullet had torn through muscle and shattered bone in the left leg. American protocol required immediate surgery to prevent infection and save the limb. Wells prepared the operating room. Huber sterilized instruments. The surgeon arrived. They scrubbed, they gloved, they entered the surgical theater. The patient lay on the table, already anesthetized. Huber had assisted in dozens of surgeries by then. Appendectomies, hernia repairs, wound debridements, emergency procedures, routine procedures. He had learned to anticipate needs, to hand instruments before they were requested, to maintain sterile field, to focus completely on the patient. But this surgery was different. The patient was not a prisoner. The patient was an American guard, Corporal James Morrison, 23 years old, from Iowa. Huber had seen him around the compound, nodded to him in passing, exchanged brief greetings. Now Morrison lay unconscious on the operating table, bleeding, broken, vulnerable, and Huber was being asked to help save his life. The surgeon worked quickly, cutting, clamping, cauterizing. Wells assisted on one side, Huber on the other. The same team that treated prisoners, the same equipment, the same procedures, the same level of care and attention. No one hesitated. No one questioned whether a German prisoner should be allowed to assist in surgery on an American guard. The patient needed help. The team provided it. Nationality became irrelevant when measured against medical necessity. The surgery lasted 3 hours. The bullet fragments were removed. The bone was set. The muscle was repaired. The wound was closed. Morrison was taken to recovery. The surgery was successful. Huber's voice cracked later when he tried to describe what this meant. Not the surgery itself. The implications. In his country, under his government, such a thing would have been unthinkable. Enemy prisoners treating their captors. Impossible. Dangerous. Treasonous. But here it was routine. The guard recovered. He returned to duty 3 weeks later. He nodded to Huber when they passed in the compound. A simple nod. Acknowledgement. Recognition. Thank you. This moment marked the true turning point. Not the dining hall tables, not the jazz orchestra, not the 80 cents a day. This. The realization that American values were not propaganda. They were practice. Huber expected enemies. He found colleagues. He expected punishment. He found training. He expected death. He found his future. The war continued outside Camp Clinton. News filtered in through newspapers and radio broadcasts. Germany was losing. Everyone knew it. The question was not if, but when. And what would happen to the prisoners after? Some prisoners worried, some planned, some simply waited. Huber focused on his work in the hospital. Every day brought new knowledge. Every surgery taught new techniques. Every patient interaction built new skills. He wrote letters home to Gertrude every week, his fiancée. They had met in Munich before the war. She worked in a bookstore. He studied for medical school entrance exams. They had planned to marry after his graduation. Then, Operation Weiss changed everything. She had waited for him through 3 years of African campaign. 3 years of uncertainty. 3 years of letters that arrived months late or not at all. 3 years of wondering if he was alive or dead. She had waited, and she would wait through captivity too. But Huber did not know if his letters reached her. The Red Cross tried to maintain mail service. But Germany was collapsing. Cities were being bombed. Infrastructure was destroyed. Mail was uncertain at best. Many letters never arrived. Many more were lost in transit. He wrote anyway, every week, sometimes twice a week. He described the hospital in careful terms, the work he was doing, the skills he was learning, the training he was receiving. He did not mention the details that would have seemed impossible. He did not describe the set tables. She would not believe it. He did not mention the jazz orchestra. It would sound like fantasy. He did not talk about the 80 cents a day. It would seem like propaganda. These things were too far outside German experience to be believable. Instead, he wrote about medicine, about surgical procedures, about patient care, about working with American medical staff. She would understand these things. She had supported his dream of medical school before the war. She would understand that the dream was alive again. In her letters back, when they arrived, Gertrude described life in wartime Munich. The bombings, the shortages, the fear, the uncertainty. Her letters painted a picture of a city dying, a country collapsing, a world ending. The contrast between her experience and his became more stark with each exchange. She lived in ruins. He lived in relative comfort. She faced danger daily. He faced routine. She wondered if she would survive the war. He wondered what would happen after. In May 1945, Germany surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe ended. Adolf Hitler was dead. The Third Reich was destroyed. The Nazi government had collapsed. Prisoners at Camp Clinton received the news through official announcements and radio broadcasts. Some prisoners cheered. The war was over. They had survived. Some wept. Their country had been destroyed. Their comrades had died for nothing. Some sat in silence, processing the contradictory emotions of relief and grief. Huber sat in silence. Relief washed over him. The killing had stopped. Grief followed. Germany was gone. The country he had known no longer existed. Confusion came next. What happened now? What came after? The war was over, but captivity was not. Prisoners remained at Camp Clinton. Days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into months. No one knew what would happen next. Return to Germany. When? Under what conditions? To what Germany? News from Europe trickled in through newspapers and radio broadcasts. Germany was occupied, divided into zones, Soviet in the east, American, British, and French in the west. Cities lay in ruins. Millions were displaced. The economy had collapsed completely. The country Huber remembered no longer existed. The Munich of his childhood was rubble. The Bavarian mountains remained, but everything else had changed. The government, the borders, the society, the values, everything. The answer came slowly, bureaucratically. In 1946, the prisoners were removed from Camp Clinton. Not released, removed, transferred. The camp was closing. Prisoners needed to be relocated. They were sent either to Great Britain or to France for further processing. Huber went to France. The journey reversed his path to America. Train to New York, ship across the Atlantic, arrival in France, transfer to a transitional camp, more waiting, more uncertainty, more bureaucracy. He spent another year there, working, waiting. The conditions were different from Camp Clinton, much different. Less freedom, less opportunity, less dignity, no hospital work, just labor, reconstruction, cleaning up the mess of war. The French camps held no hatred toward prisoners, but they held no opportunity either. Work was manual. Conditions were basic. Food was adequate. Treatment was correct. But there was no jazz, no theater, no symphony, no surgical training, just work and waiting. Huber understood the difference. Camp Clinton had been exceptional. The French camps were normal. This was how most prisoners were treated. Not badly, not cruelly, just ordinarily. Camp Clinton had been the exception, not the rule. In late 1947, after 4.5 years of captivity, he was released. Finally, permanently. The war was over. The occupation was established. Prisoners could go home. Huber received his discharge papers, a train ticket to Munich, a small amount of money, permission to leave. He returned to Germany, to Bavaria, to Munich, to ruins. The city he remembered existed only in memory. Entire neighborhoods had been bombed into rubble. Familiar landmarks were gone. Streets were unrecognizable. People moved through wreckage like ghosts. But Gertrude was alive. She had survived. 4.5 years of waiting. 4.5 years of uncertainty. 4.5 years of war and bombs and fear. She had survived it all. She was waiting for him. They met at the train station. The same station where they had said goodbye in 1939. 8 years earlier, a lifetime earlier. They were different people now, older, harder, changed by war and separation and survival. But they were together. That was what mattered. They married within weeks of his return. A small ceremony, few guests, limited resources, but genuine joy. They had both survived. They were starting over, together. Germany was shattered beyond recognition. Cities destroyed by Allied bombing campaigns. Economy collapsed into barter and black markets. Millions dead in combat and in concentration camps. Millions more displaced, wandering through ruins searching for homes that no longer existed. The Nazi government was gone, replaced by Allied military occupation that controlled every aspect of life. The country Huber had left in 1939 no longer existed, not just physically destroyed, morally destroyed. The revelations about concentration camps, about the Holocaust, about the systematic murder of millions. These revelations shattered any remaining illusions about the regime he had served. Germans struggled to process what their government had done, what they had allowed, what they had participated in, either actively or through silence. The shame was collective, the guilt was inescapable, the responsibility was shared. But something else had changed too. Huber had changed. Camp Clinton had changed him fundamentally. He had seen an alternative. He had experienced democracy in practice. He had learned that enemies could become colleagues, that dignity mattered, that education transformed. He applied to medical school immediately. The application process was chaotic in post-war Germany. Records were missing. Files had been destroyed in bombing raids. Institutions were rebuilding from scratch. But his experience in the POW hospital counted for something. The skills he had learned under Marion Wells's guidance, the training he had received in surgical techniques, the patient care experience he had accumulated. All of this American training now served him in devastated Germany. He was accepted into medical school in Munich. The buildings were damaged but functional. The equipment was limited but adequate. The professors were dedicated despite the chaos. Classes resumed. Students studied. Medicine continued even as the country struggled to rebuild. Huber excelled. His year at Camp Clinton had given him practical experience that other students lacked. While they were learning basic procedures, he was already comfortable in surgical settings. While they were memorizing theory, he had actual patient care experience to draw upon. He specialized in urology according to one account, neurology according to another. The exact specialty became unclear in later records. What remained clear was his competence, his dedication, his success. He graduated. He became a doctor. The dream from before the war. The dream that Camp Clinton had kept alive. Subscribe to hear more incredible stories that official history forgot. We continue. The experience gained in the POW hospital defined his entire subsequent professional life. 30 years of successful medical practice in Bavaria followed. 30 years of patients treated, lives saved, skills taught. The ripple effects of that year at Camp Clinton extended far beyond one man. Every patient Huber treated was an echo of the choice Marion Rogers Wells made to teach a German prisoner instead of hate him. Every life Huber saved was evidence that American values were more than words. They were transformative. Huber successfully integrated into democratic post-war Germany. He voted. He participated in civic life. He taught younger doctors. He supported democratic institutions. His transformation from Wehrmacht communication specialist to democratic citizen was complete. But he never forgot Camp Clinton. After retirement 10 years into his later life, Huber led an active existence. He climbed mountains in his native Bavaria, the same mountains he had dreamed of during 3 years in North African desert, the same mountains he had thought about during captivity. He climbed them, often, regularly, joyfully. He played violin in an orchestra, the instrument he had only listened to at Camp Clinton. He learned, he practiced, he performed. Music had meant freedom in the prison camp. It meant community and retirement. He attended philosophy courses at Bavarian University. Not for credit, not for a degree, for understanding, for knowledge, for the joy of learning. The same impulse that had driven him toward medicine before the war drove him toward philosophy after retirement. In 1996, 53 years after his capture in Tunisia, and 49 years after his release from captivity, Huber returned to Camp Clinton for a special reunion. A reunion of former prisoners had been organized by veterans groups from both Germany and the United States. Some came from Germany, some from Austria, some from other European countries where former prisoners had settled. All came with memories of a place that had transformed their lives. The camp itself was gone, closed, decades earlier. The buildings demolished, the barbed wire removed, but the location remained, and the memories. Huber stood at the site of the old gates, where he had entered as a frightened prisoner 53 years earlier, where he had expected punishment and found opportunity instead, where his life had been transformed in ways he could never have imagined, where a simple act of setting tables had begun a chain of events that would define the rest of his life and career. He opened the symbolic gates as a free man, no longer a prisoner, a doctor, a husband, a father, a citizen of democratic Germany, a friend. Marion Rogers Wells attended the reunion. She was elderly by then, but she remembered. She remembered a young German prisoner who wanted to learn medicine. She remembered teaching him. She remembered working alongside him. She remembered treating him as a colleague. Their friendship had lasted 5 decades. Letters at first, then occasional visits, then regular correspondence. They shared news of families, professional accomplishments, personal milestones. The friendship symbolized how understanding between two cultures took root in an unlikely place. Not in diplomacy, not in treaties, but in a prison camp hospital, between a nurse and a prisoner, between enemies who chose to see humanity instead. At the reunion, Huber gave a speech. He spoke in English, good English, English he had learned at Camp Clinton. He thanked Wells. He thanked the camp administrators who had made the hospital possible. He thanked the American government for treating prisoners with dignity. He said, "I came here expecting to find punishment. Instead, I found my future. Camp Clinton gave me back what the war had taken away." The statement was simple, but its implications were profound. Humane treatment of enemies can transform them into friends. Education can break the cycle of hatred. Dignity can heal even the wounds of war. These are not abstract principles, they are proven realities. Demonstrated by one German prisoner, one American nurse, one prison camp in Mississippi. Huber's story challenges assumptions about prisoners of war, about enemies, about redemption, about transformation. It suggests that the way societies treat their enemies reveals more about themselves than about their enemies. America could have treated German prisoners with cruelty. It would have been understandable. Germany had started the war. Germany had committed atrocities. Germany deserved punishment. Instead, America chose a different path. Not naive, not foolish, strategic, moral, practical. Treat prisoners well. Give them opportunities. Show them what democracy looks like in practice. The results speak for themselves. Thousands of German prisoners returned home after the war. Many became leaders in democratic West Germany. Many became advocates for American-German friendship. Many, like Huber, spent their lives demonstrating that former enemies can become partners. This was not accidental. This was policy. American policy based on American values. Values that insisted human dignity transcends nationality. That education matters. That redemption is possible. That enemies can change. Camp Clinton represented these values in concrete form. Set tables, equipped hospitals, jazz orchestras, theater groups, 80 cents a day. These were not luxuries. They were investments. Investments in a future where former enemies might become friends. The investment paid off. Germany and America became allies, NATO partners, economic partners, cultural partners. The transformation happened because individual Germans like Huber returned home with different ideas about America. Ideas based on experience. Ideas that could not be dismissed as propaganda. Huber told his patients about Camp Clinton. He told his children. He told anyone who would listen. He described the tables, the hospital, the music, the respect. He described Marion Rogers Wells and her willingness to teach an enemy. His stories spread, person to person, family to family, generation to generation. Small ripples that became waves, that became currents, that changed a culture. This is how societies transform. Not through grand declarations, through small acts repeated consistently, through nurses who teach prisoners, through administrators who set tables, through governments that choose dignity over revenge. Huber died in the early 2000s. The exact date is unclear. What is clear is his legacy. 30 years of medical practice, dozens of young doctors trained, hundreds of patients treated, thousands of lives touched, all because an American prison camp gave him opportunity instead of punishment. His children inherited his love for the mountains, his appreciation for music, his commitment to democracy, his friendship with America. These inheritances matter more than money or property. They shape how societies evolve. Marion Rogers Wells died in 2007. She was 92. Huber had died by then, but their friendship persisted in memory, in letters preserved by families, in stories told at reunions, in the example they set for others. The Camp Clinton reunion continued for years after 1996. Former prisoners returned regularly, brought families, showed children and grandchildren where transformation had occurred, where enemies had become friends, where hatred had been replaced by understanding. The site itself remains empty. No monument marks it. No plaque explains its significance. But that absence is appropriate. The memorial is not in stone. It is in lives, in relationships, in the German-American partnership that grew from small acts of dignity. What does Huber's story teach? That enemies are not born, they are made, and they can be unmade. That transformation requires opportunity, that dignity matters, that education heals, that choices have consequences that ripple through decades. America chose to set the tables at Camp Clinton. That choice echoed through Huber's life, through his patients' lives, through his children's lives, through German-American relations, through history, one man, one nurse, one prison camp, 50 years of friendship, 30 years of medical practice. Countless lives changed. This is how the world transforms, not through grand gestures, through consistent daily choices to treat others with dignity. The tables were set. That simple act contained within it the seed of transformation. Huber expected punishment. He found his future. He expected enemies. He found colleagues. He expected death. He found life. And, decades later, standing at the gates of Camp Clinton as a free man, he understood what had happened. Not luck, not accident, choice. American choice to treat prisoners as human beings who could change. German choice to accept that treatment and let it change him. Both choices mattered. Both were necessary. Together they created something that he endured long after the camp closed, long after the war ended, long after the prisoners went home. They created a legacy, not in monuments, in relationships, in understanding, in the knowledge that enemies can become friends, that war does not have to breed eternal hatred, that dignity and education and opportunity can break cycles of violence. This legacy lives on in German-American friendship, in NATO, in transatlantic partnerships, in cultural exchanges, in every German student who studies in America, in every American tourist welcomed in Bavaria, in every joint military exercise, in every shared democratic value. The foundations were laid in places like Camp Clinton, by people like Marion Rogers Wells, by prisoners like Joseph Huber. They did not know they were building these foundations. They were just doing their jobs, teaching, learning, treating patients, setting tables. But small acts accumulate. 12 months of working together became 50 years of friendship. 50 years of friendship became a template for two nations. Two nations became allies who shaped the post-war world. Huber's journey from prisoner to doctor to friend symbolizes this larger transformation. He started as an enemy. He became a partner. The transformation was possible because someone chose to set the tables. Someone chose to equip the hospital. Someone chose to hire Marion Rogers Wells. Someone chose to treat prisoners with dignity. These choices were not guaranteed. They were not inevitable. They required vision. They required courage. They required belief that human beings can change. That education matters. That dignity transforms. Today, when nations face choices about how to treat prisoners, how to handle enemies, how to approach those they defeat, Huber's story offers a model. Not naive, not foolish, strategic, moral, practical. Treat them with dignity. Give them opportunity. Show them alternatives. Let them change. Then, let them go home to build something better. This is not weakness, this is strength. The strength to believe that enemies today can become partners tomorrow. The strength to invest in that future, even when the outcome is uncertain. The strength to set the tables. Huber believed this. He lived this. He demonstrated this for 30 years of medical practice and decades of friendship with America. He showed that transformation is possible, that bridges can be built, that understanding can replace hatred. His story continues to resonate because it speaks to fundamental questions. How do we treat enemies? What do we owe to those we defeat? How do we break cycles of violence? How do we build lasting peace? The answers are not simple, but they start with recognition. Recognition that enemies are human, that they can change, that how we treat them matters, that small acts of dignity ripple through time. The tables were set at Camp Clinton. That act contained within it all these principles. Huber walked into that dining hall expecting punishment. He saw silverware. His world shifted. His future changed. His life transformed. And 50 years later, he returned to thank those who had set the tables, to honor Marion Rogers Wells, to celebrate a friendship that had endured, to demonstrate that former enemies can become not just allies but friends. This is the legacy of Camp Clinton. Not in buildings or monuments, in people, in relationships, in transformed lives, in bridges built between former enemies, in the knowledge that dignity, education, and opportunity can change the world. One person at a time. One table setting at a time. One act of respect at a time. The tables were set, and everything changed.